The gunshot that shattered the morning silence wasn't meant for Caroline Porter, but the bullet that ricocheted off the stone well and tore through her sleeve made it clear she'd stumbled into something dangerous in the mountains outside McGill, Nevada. She pressed herself against the rough bark of a pine tree, heart hammering against her ribs as voices echoed through the September morning mist of 1878. Her chestnut mare had bolted at the first crack of gunfire, leaving her stranded in these unfamiliar woods with nothing but the basket of wild herbs she'd been gathering and a growing sense of dread. Caroline had only arrived in McGill 3 weeks ago, fleeing St. Louis and a future she couldn't accept. She hadn't expected to find herself caught in a territorial dispute between trappers before she'd even properly settled into the boarding house. "Come out, Everhart. We know you're up here." The voice was rough, angry, belonging to someone who clearly had no intention of talking things through peacefully. Another voice, deeper and calmer, responded from somewhere to her left. "Randolph, you've got no claim to this territory. I've been working these slopes for 5 years. Your lines are down by Copper Creek, and you know it." Caroline tried to make herself smaller against the tree, praying they wouldn't notice her. She'd been so desperate to escape the suffocating expectations of St. Louis society, to avoid the marriage her father had arranged to Thomas Whitmore, a banker twice her age with wandering hands and a reputation for cruelty. McGill had seemed like salvation, a place where she could disappear and start fresh. Now she wondered if she'd simply traded one kind of danger for another. The argument continued, growing more heated. She caught fragments about trap lines and stolen pelts, about territory and respect. Then the shooting started again, and Caroline couldn't help the small cry that escaped her lips. The woods went silent. "Who's there?" the angry voice Randolph called out. "Show yourself." Caroline squeezed her eyes shut, cursing her own foolishness. She should have stayed quiet, should have remained perfectly still. Now they knew someone had witnessed their confrontation, and that made her a liability. Heavy footsteps crunched through the underbrush, heading in her direction. She opened her eyes and peered around the tree trunk, searching desperately for an escape route. The forest stretched dense and unfamiliar in every direction. She'd followed a deer trail up from the road, collecting herbs she recognized from her mother's teachings, but she had no idea which way led back to safety. A man emerged from the mist, and Caroline's breath caught in her throat. He was enormous, easily over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to span the width of the path. Long dark hair fell past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that held her attention, a clear gray that assessed her with sharp intelligence. His buckskin shirt stretched across a chest and arms thick with muscle, and he carried a rifle with the casual ease of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "Easy now," he said, his voice the deeper one she'd heard earlier. "Everhart. Nobody's going to hurt you. Lucas." The angry voice came closer. "What did you find?" The big man, Lucas, held up one hand behind him without taking his eyes off Caroline. "Just a lost traveler, Randolph. She's got nothing to do with this." A second man pushed through the trees, shorter and stockier than Lucas, with a face reddened by anger and exertion. His eyes narrowed when he saw Caroline. "That's the new woman from town, the one staying at Martha's boarding house." Caroline's hands tightened on her basket. She'd hoped to keep a low profile in McGill, but in a town of barely 300 souls, a young woman arriving alone from back east had attracted attention whether she wanted it or not. "All the more reason to let her go on her way," Lucas said evenly. "She's got no part in our dispute." Randolph's expression shifted into something that made Caroline's skin crawl. "Maybe she does now. Pretty thing like that, all alone in the woods, People might wonder what she saw, what she heard. Lucas moved subtly, positioning himself between Caroline and the other man. The casual gesture made something in her chest tighten. She'd been taking care of herself for weeks now, relying on no one, trusting no one. The instinct to see protection in the stance of a strange mountain man was foolish, probably dangerous. She saw two trappers having a disagreement about territory, Lucas said, his tone hardening. Nothing worth talking about, nothing worth remembering. Isn't that right, miss? Caroline found her voice, though it came out shakier than she would have liked. I don't know anything about trap lines or territories. I was just gathering herbs. Herbs, Randolph repeated, skepticism dripping from the word. He took a step closer, and Lucas shifted again, blocking his path more obviously this time. That's close enough, Randolph. The lady said she doesn't know anything. I believe her. You should too. You protecting her, Everhart. Don't tell me the legendary Lucas Everhart has gone soft over a pretty face. Caroline saw the tension ripple through Lucas's massive frame, saw the way his jaw tightened beneath his beard. For a moment she thought violence might erupt again and she'd be caught in the middle of it. But Lucas simply smiled, though the expression held no warmth. I'm protecting the peace of these mountains. You want to settle our dispute, we'll do it proper. We'll take it to the claims office in Ely, get the boundaries surveyed official. But we don't involve innocent folks and we don't make threats. Those are the rules up here, same as they've always been. Randolph spat into the dirt. This isn't over. Never said it was. But it's over for today, and the lady goes on her way unharmed and unbothered. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and Caroline barely dared to breathe. Finally, Randolph nodded curtly and turned away, crashing back through the underbrush with considerably less care for stealth than he'd shown approaching. Lucas waited until the sounds faded completely before turning to face Caroline fully. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into mountain sun, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his gray eyes softened as they took in her torn sleeve. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Caroline glanced down at her arm. The bullet had only grazed the fabric, hadn't touched skin, but seeing the torn cotton made the danger suddenly very real. Her hands started to shake. "I'm fine," she managed. "Just startled." That was more than startling. That was damn foolish of Randolph to be shooting wild like that. If that bullet had been 6 inches to the left. He didn't finish the sentence, but his expression darkened. "You're bleeding." "What? No, I'm not." But when she looked again, she saw he was right. A thin line of red seeped through a scrape on her forearm that she didn't remember getting. She must have scraped it on the tree bark when she'd pressed against it. Lucas pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and held it out. When Caroline hesitated, he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell pine and wood smoke and something else. Something earthy and masculine that made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons than fear. "May I?" he asked, and the gentle courtesy in his tone surprised her. She nodded, not trusting her voice. His hands were enormous, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle as he wrapped the handkerchief around her arm, tying it with efficient care. "That should hold until you can clean it proper," he said. "Where's your horse?" She bolted at the first gunshot. Lucas's mouth tightened. Can't blame her for that. What's she look like? Chestnut mare, white star on her forehead, brown saddle. I'll find her for you. These woods aren't safe for a woman alone, especially not now with Randolph all riled up. He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "I'll walk you back to town." Caroline wanted to refuse, wanted to insist she could manage on her own. She'd been managing on her own since she'd climbed out her bedroom window in St. Louis, and caught the train west with nothing but a small bag and the money she'd saved from her mother's inheritance. But the truth was, she had no idea which direction led back to the road, and her arm was starting to throb. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That's very kind." Something flickered in Lucas's eyes, an expression she couldn't quite read. "Not kind, just decent. Come on, the road's this way." He started walking, and Caroline fell into step beside him, having to take 2 steps for every one of his long strides. The forest seemed different now, less menacing with this large, quiet man leading the way. He moved through the woods like he was part of them, stepping over roots and ducking branches with unconscious grace that seemed at odds with his size. "You're really new to McGill," he said after a few minutes of silence. It wasn't quite a question. 3 weeks, Caroline confirmed. "I came from St. Louis." "Long way to travel." "Yes." He glanced at her, clearly waiting for more explanation, but Caroline kept her lips pressed together. She'd learned quickly that people in small towns were curious, sometimes dangerously so. The less she revealed about her reasons for leaving, the better. "Martha Kendrick runs a good boarding house," Lucas said when it became clear she wasn't going to elaborate. "She'll treat you fair." "She's been very kind." "You planning to stay in McGill long?" The question made Caroline's chest tighten. She didn't know. She'd chosen McGill because it was small and remote, unlikely to be the first place her father or Thomas Whitmore would think to look for her. But she'd also chosen it because it was near enough to larger towns like Ely where she might find work, might build an actual life. She'd been a teacher in St. Louis, before her mother's death, had left her alone with a father who saw her only as a bargaining chip in business deals. "I haven't decided," she said finally. Lucas nodded as though that was a perfectly reasonable answer. "Fair enough. McGill's not for everyone. Winter comes hard up here, and there's not much in the way of society like you're probably used to." "I'm not looking for society." "What are you looking for?" The question was too direct, too perceptive. Caroline stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why do you care?" Lucas stopped too, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Caroline became acutely aware of how alone they were, how far from town, how little she actually knew about this man beyond the fact that he'd positioned himself between her and danger. But when she looked into his gray eyes, she saw no threat, only a quiet curiosity and something else, something that looked almost like understanding. "Because Randolph saw you," Lucas said simply. "That makes you part of this whether you want to be or not. He's not a good man, Miss Porter." "Caroline Porter." "Miss Porter. Randolph's not a good man, and he holds grudges. I need to know if you're staying in McGill, because if you are, I need to make sure he doesn't decide you're a loose end worth tying up." A chill ran down Caroline's spine. "Are you trying to frighten me?" "I'm trying to be honest with you. Randolph Palmer's been trying to expand his territory for months now. He's been setting traps on land that isn't his, poaching from other men's lines. I've caught him at it twice, and today was going to be the 3rd time. He doesn't like being caught. Doesn't like having witnesses. Then maybe I should leave McGill. Maybe you should. Or maybe you should stay, and I'll make sure Randolph knows that anyone who troubles you will have to answer to me." Caroline stared at him. "You don't even know me. Why would you do that?" Lucas was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the trees around them before returning to her face. "My mother came west alone in 1850. She was running from something back in Ohio, never would say what. The mountain men in these parts, they could have made her life hell. Some of them wanted to. But there was one old trapper, Jacob Strand, who made it clear she was under his protection. Nobody touched her because of that. She met my father 2 years later, married him, and they built a good life together before the fever took them both in '72. "I'm sorry," Caroline said softly. "The point is, Jacob Strand gave my mother the space to breathe, to figure out what she wanted without being pushed or threatened or forced. She used to say that was the greatest gift anyone ever gave her, the freedom to choose her own path. Caroline's throat tightened. Freedom to choose. She'd fled St. Louis because that freedom had been stolen from her, because her father had decided her future without caring what she wanted. The idea that this stranger, this mountain man she'd known for all of 20 minutes, understood that need, made something crack in the careful walls she'd built around herself. "Thank you," she whispered. Lucas nodded and started walking again. They continued in silence for another 10 minutes before the trees began to thin and Caroline could see the dirt road that led back to McGill. And there, grazing peacefully on the grass by the roadside, was her chestnut mare. "Well, that makes things easier," Lucas said with the hint of a smile. She didn't go far. He approached the mare slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones that the horse responded to immediately. Within moments, he had her reins in hand and was leading her back to Caroline. "She's a good horse," he said, running a hand along her neck. "Sensible to run from gunfire, smart enough to stay near the road." Caroline took the reins, her fingers brushing against Lucas's hand in the exchange. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, and she pulled back quickly, busying herself with checking the saddle. "Will you be all right getting back to town from here?" Lucas asked. "Yes, I know the way." Caroline swung herself up into the saddle, grateful for the height it gave her. Looking down at Lucas made her feel less overwhelmed by his presence, though even mounted she barely had more than a few inches on him. "Thank you again, for everything, Miss Porter," Lucas said, his gray eyes serious. "I meant what I said about making sure you're safe. If Randolph or anyone else troubles you, you let me know." "How would I even do that? I don't know where you live." "Ask at the trading post in town. Old Henry knows how to find me, or ask at the claims office. They know all the trappers' territories." Caroline nodded, though she couldn't imagine actually seeking out this man again. The encounter had been strange enough, confusing enough. The last thing she needed was to get entangled in mountain politics or territorial disputes between trappers. "I'll keep that in mind," she said politely. Lucas stepped back and Caroline urged her mare forward. She made it perhaps 20 feet down the road before his voice stopped her. "Miss Porter," she turned in the saddle. "Welcome to McGill," he said, and this time his smile reached his eyes, transforming his rugged face into something almost boyish despite the beard and the weathered lines. "I hope you find what you're looking for here." Then he turned and disappeared back into the trees, moving silently for such a large man. Caroline watched the spot where he'd vanished for a long moment, before shaking herself and continuing toward town. McGill came into view as she rounded the bend, a collection of weathered buildings clustered along the dusty main street. The town had sprung up to service the copper mines in the area, and while the mining hadn't panned out as hoped, enough people had stayed to create a small, stubborn community. Caroline had chosen it partly because of its size, small enough to be overlooked, big enough to offer basic amenities, and partly because the advertisement she'd seen for a schoolteacher position had seemed like a sign from the universe. She rode directly to Martha Kendrick's boarding house, a neat 2-story building with a covered porch and flower boxes that Martha tended with fierce determination despite the harsh climate. Martha herself emerged as Caroline dismounted, her round face creased with concern. "Caroline, I was beginning to worry. You said you'd be back by mid-morning." "I'm sorry, Martha. I went further than I intended." Caroline looped her mare's reins around the hitching post and retrieved her basket, now somewhat the worse for wear. Martha's sharp eyes caught the handkerchief tied around Caroline's arm. "What happened to you? Just a scrape. It's nothing." "Nothing, my foot. Come inside, let me clean that properly." Martha ushered Caroline through the front door and into the boarding house's tidy kitchen. "Did you fall? That mare of yours throw you?" "No, nothing like that. I just scraped it on a tree." Caroline sat at the kitchen table while Martha pumped water and gathered clean cloth. She debated how much to tell the older woman and decided less was better. "I heard gunshots in the woods and got startled." Martha's hands stilled. "Gunshots? Where? Up in the hills, maybe 2 miles from the road." "Probably trappers," Martha said, her lips thinning. "They've been feuding something terrible this season. Did you see who it was?" Caroline hesitated. "I saw 2 men. They didn't bother me." "2 men? Let me guess. One was Randolph Palmer and the other was probably Lucas Everhart. Those two have been at each other's throats for months." Caroline tried to keep her expression neutral as Martha unwrapped the handkerchief and began cleaning the scrape. "I don't know their names." "Well, if you saw a big fellow, tall as a door and twice as wide, with hair down to his shoulders, that'd be Lucas Everhart. Mountain man, been in these parts for years. Keeps to himself mostly, comes to town maybe once a month for supplies." "The other one, shorter, mean-looking, that'd be Randolph Palmer. He's trouble, that one." "Why trouble?" Martha pursed her lips as she dabbed antiseptic on Caroline's arm, making her wince. "Randolph came here about a year ago from California. Claims he's a trapper, but I've heard stories. Gambling debts, trouble with women. He's got a temper and no respect for other people's boundaries." "And the other man, Lucas Everhart," something in Martha's expression softened. "Lucas is different. His folks were good people, settled here before the mining boom. When they died, Lucas took to the mountains. He's got a cabin up there somewhere, lives off his trapping and hunting. Honest as the day is long, or so they say. I've only met him a few times when he comes to town, but he's always been polite." Caroline absorbed this information in silence. It matched her impression of Lucas, but she'd learned the hard way that first impressions could be dangerously misleading. Thomas Whitmore had seemed charming and genteel in public. It was only after the engagement had been announced that she'd learned about his previous wife's mysterious death, the servants who quit without reference rather than continue in his household. "There," Martha said, tying off a fresh bandage. "That should heal up fine." "But Caroline, you need to be more careful. These mountains aren't like city parks back east. There are dangers beyond just wayward bullets." "I know. I'll stay closer to town from now on." Martha studied her for a moment, and Caroline had the uncomfortable feeling that the older woman saw far more than she let on. "You're running from something," Martha said finally. "I could tell that the moment you stepped off the stage. I won't pry, and I won't tell anyone your business. But if you're going to stay in McGill, you need to understand how things work here. We're a small community. We look out for each other, but we also notice things. People will have questions about a young woman traveling alone, staying in a boarding house instead of with family. You'll need answers, even if they're not the whole truth." Caroline met her eyes steadily. "I'm a teacher. I came to McGill because I saw the advertisement for the schoolteacher position. I'm 22 years old, unmarried, and I have no family left back east. That's all anyone needs to know." It was mostly true. She'd trained as a teacher, though she'd never actually taught. Her mother had died 6 months ago, and she had no family she was willing to claim. Her father had made his choice when he tried to sell her like cattle to Thomas Whitmore. Martha nodded slowly. "The school board will want to meet with you properly. They've been managing with Clara Henderson teaching the children in her parlor, but Clara's 67 and her arthritis is getting worse. They need someone younger, someone who can handle a full classroom. When can I meet them?" "I'll send word, probably within the week." Martha paused. "And Caroline, that handkerchief you used on your arm, that's good cloth, mountain made. If it came from Lucas Everhart, you can trust him." Whatever you saw in those woods, whatever those men were fighting about, Lucas wouldn't have let harm come to you. Caroline's fingers went to the bandage on her arm, beneath which lay Lucas's handkerchief. She'd forgotten it in her haste to get cleaned up. I should return it. You could, Martha agreed. Or you could keep it until he comes to town next, give you an excuse to thank him proper. There was something in Martha's tone that made Caroline look up sharply, but the older woman's expression was innocent. Too innocent. I'm not looking for any entanglements, Caroline said firmly. Who said anything about entanglements? I'm just saying it's polite to thank someone who helped you, and Lucas Everhart could use some human kindness. He's been alone up in those mountains too long. Over the next week, Caroline settled more deeply into life in McGill. She met with the school board, 5 men and 2 women who questioned her credentials and her background with varying degrees of suspicion and hope. She provided references from her training in St. Louis, carefully chosen to be difficult to verify quickly. She spoke about her love of teaching, her belief in education for all children, her willingness to adapt to the challenges of a frontier classroom. In the end, they offered her the position. The salary was modest, but it came with a small cottage that currently served as storage for the church. With some cleaning and basic repairs, it could be made habitable. Caroline accepted immediately. She spent the following days scrubbing floors and windows, hauling out broken furniture and boxes of mildewed hymnals. Several women from the town came to help, and through their chatter, Caroline learned more about McGill and its inhabitants. She learned that Randolph Palmer had arrived in town with money that he'd spent freely at first, buying drinks and making promises. He'd claimed to be an experienced trapper, but his catches were inconsistent, and there were whispers that he supplemented his income with less savory pursuits. She learned that Lucas Everhart was something of a legend in the area, a man who could track anything through the mountains, who knew every trail and stream for 50 miles. He'd saved a family from a snowstorm 2 winters ago, carrying both children down the mountain on his back while leading their injured father. He'd tracked down a rabid wolf that had been terrorizing homesteads. He'd found a little girl who'd wandered away from her parents' camp and been lost for 3 days. Why doesn't he come to town more often? Caroline asked, trying to keep her tone casual. What would he come for? One of the women, Sarah Chen, replied. He's got everything he needs up in the mountains. Besides, after what happened with Margaret Palmer, can you blame him for keeping his distance? Margaret Palmer, Caroline's interest sharpened. Related to Randolph. The women exchanged glances, and Caroline sensed she'd touched on something significant. Randolph's sister, Sarah said finally. She came with him when he first arrived. Pretty thing, all blonde curls and big blue eyes. She set her cap at Lucas the first time she saw him, followed him around town like a puppy. Lucas was polite but not interested. Margaret didn't take the hint. What happened? She told everyone in town that Lucas had proposed to her, that they were going to be married. Started making plans, talking about how she'd transform his mountain cabin into a proper home. Lucas came to town and heard the rumors. Set the record straight in front of half the town, saying he'd never proposed, never courted her, never given her any reason to think he wanted to marry her. Caroline winced, imagining the humiliation. Margaret left town a month later, Sarah continued. Randolph blamed Lucas for shaming his sister, even though it was Margaret's own lies that caused the trouble. That's when the problems between them really started. Before that, they'd had the normal disputes over territory that trappers have. After Margaret left, it got personal. The story bothered Caroline more than she wanted to admit. Not because she thought Lucas had done anything wrong, but because she recognized something of herself in Margaret Palmer's situation. Not the lies, but the desperate attempt to secure safety through marriage, to attach herself to a man who seemed strong enough to protect her from the world. Caroline had almost let herself be pushed into exactly that kind of arrangement with Thomas Whitmore, except it had been her father doing the pushing rather than her own desperation. The fact that Lucas had refused, had chosen honesty even when it would have been easier to go along with the fiction, spoke to a kind of integrity that Caroline found both admirable and dangerous. Admirable because it was rare. Dangerous because it made her want to trust him, and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The cottage was habitable by the end of the second week, and Caroline moved her few belongings from the boarding house with Martha's help. It felt strange to have her own space again, stranger still to have it in this rough frontier town instead of the comfortable home she'd grown up in. But there was freedom in it too. No one telling her when to wake or what to wear or who to entertain. No father's voice dripping with disappointment. No Thomas Whitmore's fingers pressing too hard on her arm, his breath too close to her neck. School would start in another week, at the beginning of October. Caroline spent her time preparing lessons, arranging the schoolhouse, which was really just a large room attached to the church, and trying not to think about gray eyes and gentle hands and a deep voice promising protection. She almost succeeded. Then Randolph Palmer showed up at her cottage door. It was evening, the sun setting in brilliant orange and red across the mountains. Caroline had been preparing dinner, enjoying the quiet solitude when the knock came. She opened the door expecting Martha or perhaps Sarah Chen, who'd promised to bring her some preserves. Instead, she found Randolph Palmer, hat in hand, smile on his face. "Miss Porter," he said smoothly, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Every instinct Caroline had screamed danger. She kept her expression polite but didn't move from blocking the doorway. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Palmer? I heard you'd taken the teaching position. Wanted to come by and welcome you properly to McGill. Also wanted to apologize for what happened up in the mountains. Must have given you quite a scare." His tone was friendly, his smile practiced, but Caroline didn't miss the way his eyes lingered on her face, traveled down her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "No apology necessary," she said coolly. "If you'll excuse me, I was just preparing dinner." Of course. "I won't keep you. I just wanted to extend an invitation. There's a dance in town Saturday night, social gathering at the church. I'd be honored if you'd allow me to escort you." Caroline's hands tightened on the door frame. "That's very kind, but I'll be attending on my own." A lovely young woman like yourself shouldn't be alone at these events. People talk, you know. They wonder about a woman with no family, no husband. Having a proper escort would help with that. The implied threat was clear. Refuse him, and he'd make sure the gossip mills turned against her. Accept, and she'd be signaling that she was open to his courtship. Either way, he was trying to trap her. "I appreciate your concern," Caroline said, her voice cold now, "but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own reputation. Good evening, Mr. Palmer." She started to close the door, but Randolph put his hand against it, not pushing but stopping its movement. "You're new here, Miss Porter. You don't understand how things work. A woman needs protection in a town like this, needs someone to look out for her interests. I'll keep that in mind. Now please remove your hand from my door." For a moment she thought he might refuse. His smile had frozen into something harder, uglier. Then he stepped back, replacing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "As you wish, but do think about what I said. McGill can be a difficult place for a woman alone. Accidents happen. Reputations get ruined. Would be a shame if something were to damage your prospects here." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Caroline shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. She closed the door and locked it, then went to check that all the windows were secured as well. The next morning, she went to the trading post and asked for old Henry. The proprietor was a weathered man in his 70s with sharp blue eyes and gnarled hands. He listened to Caroline's request without interrupting, then nodded slowly. "You want to get word to Lucas Everhart," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, can you do that?" "Can, but it might take a few days. Lucas doesn't keep to a schedule. Could be at his cabin, could be checking his trap lines, could be anywhere within 30 miles of here. I can wait a few days." Old Henry studied her with those keen eyes. "Randolph Palmer been bothering you?" Caroline hesitated, then nodded. "He came to my cottage last night. Made some implied threats about my reputation and safety if I didn't accept his courtship." "That sounds like Randolph." "All right, Miss Porter. I'll get word to Lucas. Might be sooner than a few days if I'm lucky. Lucas has friends in these mountains and news travels faster than you'd think." "Thank you." Caroline left the trading post feeling simultaneously relieved and anxious. She was asking a stranger to intervene in her life, to take on her problems as his own. Everything in her hard-won independence rebelled against the idea, but she also understood the reality of her situation. She had no legal recourse against Randolph's veiled threats. She had no family to defend her, no powerful connections to lean on. In St. Louis, she'd had her father's name if nothing else. Here, she had nothing but her own determination and the fragile goodwill of a community that didn't yet fully trust her. If Lucas Everhart was willing to help, she'd be a fool not to accept. The week passed slowly. Caroline threw herself into final preparations for school, meeting with parents, learning names and faces. She attended church on Sunday and endured Randolph Palmer's pointed stares from across the room. She made polite conversation with the women of McGill and deflected increasingly bold questions about her marital status and intentions. The dance on Saturday night loomed over everything. Caroline had decided to attend despite Randolph's threats, refusing to be driven into hiding. But she couldn't deny the anxiety that tightened her chest every time she thought about walking into that church hall alone. Saturday arrived cool and clear, the October air carrying the first real bite of approaching winter. Caroline dressed carefully in her best dress, a deep green silk that had survived the journey from St. Louis. She arranged her dark hair in a simple style and studied herself in the small mirror above her washstand. She looked older than 22, she thought. The past 6 months had carved lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. But there was strength in her face, too, a determination that her younger self had lacked. Caroline wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the evening. The church was only a few blocks away, and she could already hear music drifting from the hall. Lanterns hung from the eaves, casting warm pools of light across the yard where people gathered in small groups. She was halfway to the entrance when a figure stepped out of the shadows, and Caroline's heart leaped into her throat before she recognized the broad shoulders and long, dark hair. Lucas Everhart stood at the edge of the light, dressed in clean buckskins with his hair pulled back and his beard neatly trimmed. He looked enormous and slightly uncomfortable, like a wild animal that had been convinced to venture into civilization against its better judgment. "Miss Porter," he said, his deep voice carrying easily over the music. "Old Henry said you needed to speak with me." Relief flooded through Caroline so intensely it made her dizzy. "Mr. Everhart, thank you for coming. Just Lucas, please." He moved closer and Caroline saw concern in his gray eyes. "What happened? Did Randolph bother you? He came to my cottage, made some thinly veiled threats about what might happen if I didn't accept his courtship." Lucas's jaw tightened. "What kind of threats?" "He said accidents happen, that my reputation could be damaged, that I needed protection in a town like this." Caroline's hands twisted in her shawl. I told him I wasn't interested, but I don't think he's going to accept that. I'm sorry to involve you, but I didn't know who else to turn to. Don't apologize. You did the right thing. Lucas glanced toward the church where light and laughter spilled from the open doors. He's in there, I assume so. The whole town seems to be. Then we should go in. Caroline blinked. What? We should go in, together. If Randolph sees you have an escort, sees that you're under my protection, he'll have to back off. Lucas offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. Unless you'd rather not be seen with me. I know I'm not exactly society material. That's not it at all, Caroline said quickly. I just don't want to impose on you, to drag you into town politics and social obligations. Something flickered in Lucas's eyes, an emotion Caroline couldn't quite identify. Miss Porter, Caroline, if I may call you that, I came down from my cabin because old Henry said you needed help. I didn't come halfway down the mountain to stand in the shadows. If you'll have me as your escort this evening, I'd be honored. Caroline looked at the arm he offered, strong and steady, and thought about all the reasons she should refuse. She'd come to McGill to be independent, to rely on no one but herself. She'd sworn off men and their promises after seeing what those promises had done to her mother, after nearly falling into Thomas Whitmore's trap. But this was different, wasn't it? Lucas wasn't offering marriage or claiming ownership. He was offering protection freely given, asking nothing in return. The freedom to choose, just like he'd promised in the woods. Caroline placed her hand on his arm. Thank you, Lucas. I'd be grateful for your company. They walked into the church hall together, and the reaction was immediate. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. By the time they'd crossed to the refreshment table, every person in the room was aware that Caroline Porter had arrived on the arm of Lucas Everhart. Caroline felt the weight of those stares, heard the whispers starting already. But Lucas seemed unbothered, his expression calm as he fetched her a cup of punch and positioned himself slightly behind her, a solid, protective presence. You're causing quite a stir, Caroline murmured. Good. Let them stir. Let Randolph see that you're not alone and unprotected. As if summoned by his name, Randolph Palmer appeared through the crowd. His face darkened when he saw Lucas, but he kept his tone civil. Everhart, didn't expect to see you at a social gathering. Things change, Lucas replied mildly. Randolph's attention shifted to Caroline, and she saw anger flicker beneath his practiced smile. Miss Porter, I see you found an escort after all. Mr. Everhart was kind enough to accompany me, yes. How fortunate. Though I have to wonder what brought him down from his mountain hermitage. You must have quite the powers of persuasion. The implication was clear and insulting. Caroline felt Lucas tense beside her, but she spoke before he could. Mr. Everhart and I became acquainted when he assisted me after an unfortunate incident in the woods. When he heard I was attending the dance, he graciously offered his company. There's nothing more to it than simple courtesy, something you might consider practicing yourself. The words were polite enough, but the ice in Caroline's tone made several nearby people draw sharp breaths. Randolph's smile turned brittle. Careful, Miss Porter. You're new here. You don't want to make enemies. And you don't want to make threats in front of witnesses, Lucas said quietly. Especially not to a lady under my protection. The two men stared at each other, and Caroline felt the tension crackle between them like summer lightning. Then Martha Kendrick appeared, her round face beaming with determined cheerfulness. Caroline, Lucas, how wonderful to see you both. Caroline, I absolutely must introduce you to Alina Morrison. She has 3 children who will be in your class, and she's been dying to meet you properly. Martha linked her arm through Caroline's and began steering her away, calling over her shoulder. Lucas, be a dear and keep my husband company, won't you? He's over by the musicians and could use someone to talk to besides the pastor. It was a masterful intervention, and Caroline allowed herself to be swept away. But not before she caught Lucas's eye and saw something there that made her breath catch. Not just concern or protectiveness, but something warmer, something that felt almost like admiration. The evening passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. Caroline met parents and children, answered questions about her teaching philosophy and background, and deflected increasingly pointed inquiries about her relationship with Lucas Everhart. Through it all, she was aware of Lucas on the other side of the room, his height making him easy to spot in any crowd. He didn't hover or intrude, but his presence was constant. A reminder to everyone in the room that Caroline Porter was not alone, not unprotected. And more than once, Caroline found herself looking for him in the crowd, found her eyes drawn to his tall figure and finding reassurance in his calm, steady presence. When the dancing started, Caroline expected Lucas to remain on the sidelines. He didn't seem like the type to enjoy social dancing. So she was surprised when he appeared at her elbow during a lull in the music. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. "I didn't take you for a dancer. My mother insisted I learn, said a man should know how to move gracefully, even if he chooses to spend most of his time in the wilderness." Lucas offered his hand. "I'm probably rusty, but I promise not to step on your feet too badly." Caroline placed her hand in his, and Lucas led her onto the floor as the musicians struck up a waltz. His hand settled at her waist, large and warm, and Caroline rested her other hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid muscle beneath the buckskin. They began to move, and Caroline discovered that Lucas had undersold his abilities. He danced well, leading her through the steps with confidence and surprising grace for such a large man. They moved together easily, and Caroline found herself relaxing into his lead. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming tonight, for all of this. You don't need to keep thanking me." "I do, though. You didn't have to help me. You don't owe me anything." Lucas was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. "Maybe I wanted to help. Maybe I'm tired of standing by while men like Randolph Palmer think they can push people around just because they're bigger or meaner or have more money." "Is that the only reason?" The question was out before Caroline could stop it. Too bold, too revealing. But Lucas didn't seem offended. Instead, a small smile tugged at his lips. "No," he said simply, "that's not the only reason." Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs. "What's the other reason? You want the truth, always." "Because when I saw you in those woods, scared but standing your ground, refusing to let Randolph intimidate you, I saw someone worth knowing. Someone brave enough to run toward an uncertain future rather than accept a life that didn't fit. I recognized that, Caroline. I've been running toward the uncertain for most of my life." The honesty in his voice, the understanding in his eyes, made something crack in Caroline's carefully maintained defenses. "I came here to be independent," she whispered, "to rely on no one but myself, but I'm terrified of Randolph Palmer. I'm terrified that everything I've built here will fall apart because I can't protect myself. You're not weak for asking for help, and accepting protection doesn't mean giving up your independence." Lucas's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I'm not asking to control your life or make your decisions. I'm just offering to stand between you and the people who might hurt you while you build the life you want. There's no price, no expectations, just the help freely given." "Why?" Caroline asked, blinking back tears she hadn't realized were threatening. "Why would you do that for someone you barely know?" "Because someone did it for my mother once. Because it's the right thing to do. And because," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "because I'd like to get to know you better if you're willing. No pressure, no courtship if you don't want it. Just friendship, if that's all you're looking for." The music swelled around them, and Caroline made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "I'd like that too, to know you better. As friends and maybe, eventually, as something more if that's where things lead naturally." Lucas's smile transformed his face, and Caroline understood why Margaret Palmer had set her cap at him. Not because he was handsome, though he was in a rugged, untamed way, but because when he smiled like that, you felt like you were the only person in the world who mattered. "Then let's start there," he said. "As friends. I'll come to town more often, make sure Randolph knows you're under my protection, and maybe when you're settled and comfortable, you'd let me show you the mountains properly. The beautiful parts, not just the dangerous ones." "I'd like that," Caroline said. They danced 2 more dances before Lucas excused himself, explaining that he had a long ride back to his cabin and needed to leave before full dark. But before he left, he made a point of saying goodbye to Caroline in full view of the gathered crowd, including a scowling Randolph Palmer. "I'll be back in town next Saturday," Lucas said, loud enough for nearby listeners to hear. "Would you have dinner with me, Caroline?" At the boarding house, all proper and respectable, Caroline smiled, aware that they were performing as much as conversing. "I'd be delighted, Lucas." He tipped his hat to her, nodded to the watching crowd, and disappeared into the night. Caroline watched him go, wondering what she'd just set in motion and whether she'd regret it. Over the following weeks, Caroline discovered that she didn't regret it at all. Lucas kept his word, appearing in town every Saturday without fail. They had dinner at Martha's boarding house, walked along the creek that ran behind the town, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Lucas told her about growing up in McGill, about his parents and the old trapper Jacob Strand who taught him everything about surviving in the mountains. Caroline found herself opening up too, sharing carefully edited stories about St. Louis, her mother's death, her love of teaching. She didn't tell him about Thomas Whitmore or her father's betrayal, not yet. But Lucas seemed to sense the gaps in her story, and he never pushed for more than she was willing to share. School started, and Caroline threw herself into teaching with a passion that surprised even her. The children of McGill ranged from 5 to 14, a mixed group of mining families, ranchers and traders' children who arrived each morning eager to learn. Caroline taught them reading and arithmetic, geography and history, and found more satisfaction in their progress than she'd ever found in St. Louis society. Randolph Palmer left her alone after that first dance, but Caroline often felt his eyes on her when she was in town. It was an unpleasant reminder that the threat hadn't disappeared entirely, just retreated into the shadows. November brought the first real snow, dusting the mountains with white and turning the air crisp and cold. Lucas arrived in town one Saturday, wrapped in a heavy coat made of elk hide, his cheeks reddened by wind and his long hair frosted with ice crystals. "Winter's coming early this year," he told Caroline as they sat in the boarding house parlor, the only private space Martha would allow for unmarried couples. "The signs are all there. Heavy snow by Christmas, probably through March. Will you be all right up in the mountains?" Caroline asked, surprised by how much the question mattered to her. "I've survived worse. My cabin's well stocked and I know how to read the weather. But it means I won't be able to come to town as often. The passes get dangerous and sometimes impassable." Caroline's heart sank. Over the past month, she'd come to look forward to Lucas's weekly visits with an intensity that both thrilled and worried her. He'd become more than a protector, more than a friend. When he smiled at her, she felt warmth spread through her chest. When his hand brushed hers, even accidentally, her pulse quickened. She was falling for him, slowly but inexorably, and the thought of weeks without seeing him felt like a physical ache. "How long will you be gone?" she managed to ask. "Hard to say. Could be a few weeks, could be longer. Depends on the weather." Lucas shifted closer, his gray eyes intense. "Caroline, I need to tell you something before the snows come." "What is it?" "These past weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you, it's been the best part of my days. I come down from the mountain and the whole world seems brighter because I know I'm going to see you, talk to you, hear your laugh. And I need you to know that before I leave, because I can't go months without saying it." Caroline's breath caught. "Lucas." "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know we said we'd start as friends, see where things went naturally, and I meant that. But I also need to be honest with you, need you to know that on my side, it's gone past friendship. I've fallen for you, Caroline Porter. Completely and maybe foolishly, but there it is." The declaration hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way Caroline hadn't expected from this strong, quiet mountain man. Her own feelings surged up, too powerful to deny. "It's not foolish," she whispered, "because I've fallen for you too. I tried not to, tried to keep my walls up and my heart safe, but you slipped past all my defenses without even trying. When you leave for the mountains, I'm going to miss you terribly. And when you come back, I'm going to be watching the road every day, hoping to see you." Lucas reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Then when I come back, we'll figure out what comes next. Together." "Together," Caroline agreed. He left the next morning, heading into the mountains just ahead of a storm system that old Henry predicted would dump 2 feet of snow on the high country. Caroline stood at her cottage window and watched him go, tall and strong on his massive bay horse, and tried not to think about all the things that could happen to a man alone in winter mountains. December arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow. Caroline kept the schoolhouse warm and the children engaged, and tried not to count the days since Lucas had left. Martha gave her knowing looks but didn't pry, and for that Caroline was grateful. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when Randolph Palmer made his move. Caroline had stayed late at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for the week after the holiday break. The sun had set hours ago, but she'd been absorbed in her work and hadn't noticed the time. When she finally locked up and started toward her cottage, the streets were dark and empty, most of McGill's residents already home for dinner. She was halfway there when Randolph stepped out of an alley, blocking her path. "Miss Porter. Working late, I see." Caroline's hand tightened on her school satchel. "Mr. Palmer, excuse me, please." She tried to step around him, but Randolph moved to block her. "Not so fast, we need to talk. I don't think we have anything to discuss." "I disagree. You've been making a fool of me in this town, parading around with Lucas Everhart like you're something special. People are talking, Caroline, saying you're his woman now. But Lucas isn't here, is he? He's up in his mountain hideaway, leaving you all alone and unprotected." Fear spiked through Caroline, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm quite capable of taking care of myself. Are you? Because it seems to me you're playing a dangerous game, accepting protection from one man while refusing the honest courtship of another. Makes a woman look bad, you know. Makes people wonder about her character. My character is none of your concern." Randolph took a step closer, and Caroline backed up, her shoulders hitting the wall of the building behind her. She'd let him maneuver her into the alley without realizing it, and now the street seemed very far away. "Everything about you is my concern," Randolph said, his breath hot on her face. "Because you're going to be my wife, Caroline Porter, one way or another. Either you agree to marry me proper, or I'll make sure your reputation in this town is so destroyed you'll have no choice but to accept me." "I'll never marry you," Caroline said, her voice shaking but determined. Not if you were the last man in Nevada. Randolph's face twisted with rage, and for a terrible moment Caroline thought he might strike her. But then a voice cut through the darkness, deep and cold as mountain ice. "Step away from her, Randolph. Now." Both Caroline and Randolph turned to see Lucas emerging from the shadows at the end of the alley. He looked larger than Caroline remembered, more dangerous, his gray eyes glacial as they fixed on Randolph. "Everhart," Randolph said, trying for bravado and failing. "Thought you were snowed in up on your mountain. I came down to check on Caroline before the next storm hits. Lucky I did." Lucas moved closer and Randolph instinctively backed away from Caroline. "You threatening her?" "Trying to force her into marriage, just having a conversation. Looked like intimidation to me, sounded like it too." Lucas glanced at Caroline. "You all right?" Caroline nodded, not trusting her voice. Relief flooded through her so intensely her knees went weak. "Go home, Caroline," Lucas said gently. "I'll make sure you get there safely, right after Randolph and I have a talk." "Lucas, don't," Caroline managed. "He's not worth it." "Oh, we're just going to talk, man to man, about how things are going to be from now on." Lucas's attention returned to Randolph, and his tone hardened. "You're going to leave Caroline alone, completely. You don't talk to her, you don't look at her, you don't come within 50 feet of her. You do, and you answer to me. Understood?" "You can't tell me what to do," Randolph blustered, but there was fear in his eyes now. "I can if you threaten someone under my protection. And Caroline is under my protection, Randolph. That means she's off limits. You violate that, and I'll make sure every trapper, every miner, every rancher in 50 miles knows what kind of man you are. You'll never work these mountains again." It wasn't a physical threat, but it was far more effective. Randolph's livelihood depended on his relationships with other men in the territory. If Lucas turned them against him, he'd be finished in McGill. "Fine," Randolph spat. "Keep your woman. She's probably not worth the trouble anyway." He pushed past Lucas and disappeared into the night. Lucas waited until his footsteps faded before turning to Caroline. "Did he hurt you?" "No, just scared me." Caroline wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the night had become. "How did you know to come looking for me?" "I arrived in town an hour ago, went to your cottage to surprise you. When you weren't there, Martha told me you were working late at the school. I was heading there when I saw Randolph following you." His expression darkened. "If I'd been 5 minutes later." "But you weren't. You were here." Caroline stepped closer, drawn by the need to feel his warmth, his solidity. "You're always here when I need you." Lucas's arms came around her, pulling her against his chest, and Caroline let herself sink into his embrace. He smelled of pine and snow and wood smoke, familiar and comforting. His heart beat steady under her ear, and for the first time since he'd left, Caroline felt safe. "I'm not going back up the mountain," Lucas said quietly. "Not until spring. I'll stay in town, take a room at Martha's or camp on the outskirts. I'm not leaving you alone to deal with Randolph. You can't abandon your cabin for months because of me." "I can and I will. The cabin's secure, my traps are set. I can check them every few weeks, but I don't need to be up there constantly. And I need to be here, need to make sure you're protected." Caroline pulled back just enough to look up at his face. In the moonlight, his features were all sharp angles and shadows, but his eyes were soft as they looked down at her. "Lucas, what are we doing?" she asked. "This started as you helping a stranger, but it's become so much more. You're reorganizing your whole life for me, and I don't even know if I have the right to ask that of you." "You're not asking, I'm offering. There's a difference." Lucas raised one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing along her cheekbone. "Caroline, I told you before I left that I'd fallen for you. That hasn't changed. If anything, being away from you for 2 weeks made it clearer. I want to be wherever you are. I want to wake up knowing I'll see you that day, talk to you, hear about your students and your lessons and whatever else is happening in your life. If that means staying in town instead of the mountains, that's an easy choice. But the mountains are your home. Home is where you want to be, Lucas said simply. And I want to be here with you if you'll have me. Caroline's eyes stung with tears she didn't try to hide. I want that too, so much. But Lucas, there are things you don't know about me, reasons I came to McGill. I need to tell you before this goes any further. All right, tell me. And there, in the cold darkness of a McGill alley, Caroline told Lucas Everhart the whole truth, about her mother's death and her father's gambling debts, about Thomas Whitmore and the arranged marriage, about the things she'd learned about his previous wife's death, and the servants who wouldn't speak of him without fear in their eyes, about climbing out her window in the dead of night and running, knowing she might never be able to go back, knowing her father would be furious and possibly ruined by her refusal. I'm not a respectable woman running from tragedy, she finished, her voice breaking. I'm a runaway daughter who defied her father and broke a business agreement. If Thomas or my father ever find me, they could force me back, and anyone associated with me could be caught in that scandal. Lucas was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "You're 22 years old, Caroline, a legal adult. No one can force you into marriage against your will. The law isn't always on a woman's side, especially against wealthy men. Then we make sure you're protected by more than just the law. We make sure you have a community here, people who know you and value you and won't let you be dragged away." Lucas's hands settled on her shoulders, warm and steadying. "And if it comes to it, we make sure you have a husband who can legally stand between you and anyone who tries to claim you." Caroline's breath caught. "Lucas, are you proposing to me?" "Not right now, not like this. When I propose, it'll be because we both want marriage, not because you need legal protection. But I'm saying that if that's what it takes to keep you safe, to give you the freedom to live the life you want, I'll marry you tomorrow. Not as a trap, not as a cage, but as a shield. And if all you ever want from me is friendship and protection, I'll accept that." The tears spilled over now, running hot down Caroline's cold cheeks. "That's not all I want from you. Lucas, I want everything. I want your friendship and your protection and your love. I want to build a life with you, want to wake up next to you and fall asleep in your arms and know that we chose each other freely, without coercion or obligation." "Then that's what we'll have," Lucas said, and he bent to kiss her. His lips were warm despite the cold, gentle despite his size and strength. Caroline melted into the kiss, her hands fisting in his elk hide coat, and felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "I'm staying in town," he said firmly. "We'll take this slow, do it right. Court you proper so everyone knows my intentions are honorable. And when the time is right, when you're ready, I'll ask you to marry me. Not because you need protection, but because we want to spend our lives together." "That sounds perfect," Caroline whispered. Lucas walked her home to her cottage, waited while she lit the lamps inside, and only left after making her promise to lock all the doors and windows. Caroline watched him disappear into the night, heading toward Martha's boarding house, and touched her lips where he'd kissed her. Everything had changed in the space of one evening. The fear she'd carried since leaving St. Louis had lifted, replaced by something she'd never expected to feel again. Hope. True to his word, Lucas took a room at Martha's boarding house and settled into life in McGill for the winter. He helped repair buildings damaged by the snow, traded furs and meat for supplies, and made himself useful around town. But everyone knew the real reason he'd come down from his mountain, and they saw it in the way he looked at Caroline Porter, in the way she smiled when she saw him. They courted properly as frontier life allowed. Lucas escorted Caroline to church on Sundays, had dinner with her several times a week, and took her for long walks when the weather permitted. They talked about everything, learning each other's histories and dreams and quirks. Lucas told her about the loneliness of mountain life, the way the silence could eat at you if you let it. Caroline told him about her love of books and learning, her dream of one day opening a real school with proper supplies, and maybe even a small library. The weeks turned into months, winter deepening its grip on the Nevada mountains. Christmas came and went, celebrated with a town party where Lucas and Caroline danced together while McGill's residents looked on with approval. January brought bitter cold and storms that shut down travel for days at a time. February thawed slightly, enough for Lucas to make a trip up to his cabin to check his trap lines. He was gone for 4 days, and Caroline discovered that missing him was a physical ache, a constant awareness of his absence. When he returned, riding into town on his bay horse with snowflakes caught in his dark hair, she met him in the street and didn't care who saw her throw her arms around him. "I missed you," she said against his chest. "I missed you too," he replied, holding her tight. "Every minute I was gone." That night, over dinner at the boarding house with Martha playing chaperone in the kitchen, Lucas set down his fork and looked at Caroline with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I have something to ask you," he said. "All right. I know we said we'd take this slow, court proper. And we have. It's been 3 months since I came down from the mountain, 3 months of getting to know each other better, and every day I'm more certain that you're what I want, who I want, for the rest of my life." Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs. "Lucas, let me finish." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Caroline Porter, I love you. I love your strength and your courage and your compassion. I love the way you care about your students, the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, the way you see the good in people even when they don't deserve it. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you every single day." He stood and came around the table, and Caroline realized with shock that he was lowering himself to one knee beside her chair. "I'm not rich," Lucas said. "I can't offer you a fancy house in the city or fine dresses or servants. What I can offer you is a life in these mountains, a cabin I'll build bigger and better for you, a home filled with love and respect and partnership. I can offer you my protection, my loyalty, and my heart, freely given with no conditions. Caroline Porter, will you marry me?" The tears came again, but this time they were joyful. Caroline slid from her chair and knelt facing him, taking his face in her hands. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Lucas Everhart, I'll marry you. Not because I need your protection, though I'm grateful for it. Not because I'm afraid or desperate or trapped. But because I love you with everything I am, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." Lucas's smile was brilliant, transforming his rugged features into something beautiful. He pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple silver band with a small sapphire that caught the lamplight. "It was my mother's," he said as he slipped it onto Caroline's finger. "The only thing of hers I kept after she died. I'd be honored if you'd wear it." "It's perfect," Caroline whispered, looking at the ring through her tears. "Everything about this is perfect." Lucas kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Martha's delighted laughter from the kitchen reminded them they had an audience. But Caroline didn't care. She was engaged to the man she loved, and for the first time since her mother's death, her future looked bright. They were married in late March, as soon as the mountain passes began to clear. The whole town turned out for the wedding, held in the church where they'd first danced together. Caroline wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk that Sarah Chen had helped her make, and Lucas wore new buckskins that Martha had insisted he commission for the occasion. Caroline walked down the aisle alone, head high, and met Lucas at the front of the church. His eyes shone with emotion as he took her hands, and when the pastor asked who gave this woman to be married, Caroline spoke up clearly. "I give myself," she said, "freely and without coercion." There were murmurs from the congregation, but Lucas's smile told her he understood the significance of her words. This wasn't her father giving her away like property. This was her choice, her decision, her future that she was claiming on her own terms. They spoke their vows with clear voices and steady hands, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas pulled Caroline into a kiss that made several of the older ladies fan themselves. Caroline laughed against his lips, happier than she'd ever been. The reception was held in the church hall, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. But as the sun began to set, Lucas leaned down and whispered in Caroline's ear. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Everhart." The name sent a thrill through her. "Where exactly is home?" "I want to show you something. Will you trust me, always?" They slipped away from the party and Lucas led Caroline to where 2 horses waited, already packed with supplies. He helped her mount and they rode out of town together, heading into the mountains as the last light faded from the sky. They rode for over an hour, climbing steadily into pine-covered slopes. The air grew cooler, fresher, scented with evergreen and snow melt. Finally, they emerged into a clearing and Caroline gasped. A cabin stood in the center of the clearing, much larger than she'd expected. It was built of solid logs with a stone chimney, glass windows that caught the moonlight, and a wide porch that looked out over the valley below. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light glowed from the windows. "You've been working on it," Caroline said, stunned. "Every time I came up to check my traps, I added to it, making it bigger, better, worthy of you." Lucas dismounted and came to help Caroline down. "It's not finished. There's still work to do on the interior, furniture to build, improvements to make. But it's solid and warm and safe, and it's ours if you want it." Caroline looked at the cabin, at the mountains rising majestic around them, at the valley spreading out below where McGill's lights twinkled in the distance. Then she looked at Lucas, at this strong, gentle man who'd given her freedom when she needed it most, who'd protected her without trying to own her, who'd loved her without conditions. "It's perfect," she said. "Show me our home." Lucas carried her over the threshold, and Caroline discovered that he'd been modest about his work. The interior was beautiful, with smooth plank floors and plastered walls, a large stone fireplace, and furniture he'd clearly crafted himself. There was a main room with a kitchen area, a bedroom with a real bed frame and mattress, even a small study area with shelves for books. "Lucas, this is incredible. You built all of this yourself. I had help with some of it." Old Henry came up a few times and Jacob's son Daniel helped with the roof, but mostly yes, I built it for you, for us. Caroline turned to face him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "I love it. I love you. And I'm so grateful that I stumbled into your territory that day in September." "Best day of my life," Lucas said, pulling her into his arms. "Even with Randolph shooting at me." They laughed together and then Lucas was kissing her again, deeper this time with passion that had been held in check during their courtship. Caroline responded eagerly, her hands sliding up his chest to tangle in his long hair. Lucas lifted her easily, carried her to the bedroom and laid her gently on the bed. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with desire but his eyes searching hers. "We can wait if you're not ready." "I'm sure," Caroline said, reaching up to pull him down to her. "I'm your wife, Lucas. I want this. I want you." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, filled with whispered declarations and gentle touches, with the discovery of each other's bodies and hearts. Lucas was patient and careful, making sure Caroline's first time was everything it should be. And afterward, as they lay tangled together beneath warm blankets, Caroline felt a peace she'd never known. "I love you," she murmured against Lucas's chest. "I love you too," he replied, his arms tightening around her. "Thank you for choosing me, Caroline, for choosing this life. Thank you for giving me the freedom to choose it." They fell asleep in each other's arms, the mountain wind singing softly outside their cabin, the future stretching bright and open before them. Caroline continued teaching through that spring and into the summer, riding down to McGill 3 days a week while Lucas managed his trap lines. The arrangement worked well, giving Caroline the independence and purpose she craved while allowing them to build their life together in the mountains. By summer's end, Caroline discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a little fear, aware of the risks of childbirth on the frontier. But Caroline was strong and healthy, and Lucas made sure she had everything she needed, including a promise that when her time came, he'd fetch the midwife from McGill no matter the weather. Their son was born in early April, a healthy baby boy with dark hair and his father's gray eyes. They named him Jacob, after the trapper who'd protected Lucas's mother all those years ago. Caroline held her son and looked at her husband, at the love shining in his eyes, and knew she'd found everything she'd been searching for when she fled St. Louis: freedom, safety, love without conditions, home. The years that followed were full and rich. Caroline eventually stopped teaching regularly as their family grew, though she still tutored children who came up to the cabin, and maintained a small lending library for the families in the area. 2 years after Jacob came a daughter they named Sarah, then another son they called Thomas, after neither of them had any association with that name except the reminder of what Caroline had escaped. Lucas expanded their cabin twice, adding bedrooms and a larger kitchen, a workshop where he taught his sons to work with wood and leather. He still trapped, but he also began guiding hunting parties and leading pack trips into the high country, work that brought in steady money and allowed him to be home more often. Randolph Palmer left McGill the year after Caroline and Lucas married, driven out by debts and his poor reputation. They heard later that he'd gone to California, and they felt nothing but relief that he was far away from their life. Caroline wrote to her father once, 5 years after she'd left St. Louis. She told him she was alive and well, married to a good man, mother to 3 children. She told him she forgave him for trying to force her into marriage with Thomas Whitmore, but that she had no intention of ever returning to St. Louis or resuming contact. She heard nothing back, and she was content with that. Martha Kendrick became a beloved grandmother to their children, making the trip up to the cabin several times a year, despite her advancing age. Old Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep when Jacob was 7, and Lucas served as one of the pallbearers, honoring the old trader who'd helped bring him and Caroline together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas took Caroline back to the clearing where they'd first made love as husband and wife. The cabin had changed, expanded, weathered by mountain storms and brightened by children's laughter. But the view was the same, the mountains as majestic as ever. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked as they stood on the porch, his arms around Caroline's waist. "Choosing this life instead of the one you could have had in St. Louis?" Caroline leaned back against his solid chest and looked out at the valley, at the home they'd built, at the children playing in the yard below. "Not for a single second. You gave me something Thomas Whitmore never could have. You gave me freedom, Lucas. The freedom to choose, to build the life I wanted, to be the person I was meant to be. And you gave me love without conditions, without expectations, without trying to change or control me. How could I possibly regret that? I love you, Caroline Everhart. I love you too, Lucas, today and always. They stood together in the mountain twilight, two people who'd found each other against the odds, who'd built a life based on respect and partnership and unconditional love. The trapper who tried to trap Caroline into marriage was long gone, forgotten except as a reminder of what she'd escaped. But the mountain man who'd offered her freedom had become her whole world, her partner, her love. And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Caroline knew that she had everything she'd ever dreamed of and more. She had her mountain man, her children, her home. She had freedom and love and a future bright with possibility. She had chosen well, and she would never regret it. Their story continued through the years, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their family. Jacob grew tall and strong like his father, learning the ways of the mountains until he could track and trap almost as well as Lucas. Sarah inherited her mother's love of learning and became a teacher herself, eventually opening a proper school in Ely with Caroline's help and encouragement. Young Thomas showed an aptitude for business, and he eventually established a trading post that served trappers and miners throughout the territory. Caroline and Lucas grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They weathered droughts and hard winters, celebrated births and mourned losses, and through it all remained each other's closest companion and strongest support. On their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Lucas stood and raised his glass in a toast. "To my wife," he said, his voice still strong despite the silver threading through his dark hair. 25 years ago, I found a woman in the woods who'd had the courage to run toward freedom instead of accepting a life that didn't fit. I thought I was protecting her, but the truth is, she saved me. She brought light and laughter and purpose to my solitary mountain life. Caroline, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank God every day that you stumbled into my territory." Caroline stood too, her own hair now streaked with gray, her face lined but still beautiful to Lucas's eyes. "And I thank God for the mountain man who offered me freedom when I needed it most, who loved me without trying to own me, who gave me the space to choose my own path and then walked that path beside me. Lucas, you are my home, my heart, my everything. Here's to 25 more years together." Their family cheered, and Lucas pulled Caroline into a kiss that made their grandchildren giggle and their children shake their heads with fond exasperation. But Caroline just laughed and kissed him back, feeling the same flutter in her chest that she'd felt all those years ago when he'd first touched his lips to hers. They lived long, full lives in their mountain cabin, never regretting the choices that had brought them together. Lucas passed first, peacefully in his sleep at 73, with Caroline holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, but took comfort in knowing that he'd lived exactly the life he wanted, surrounded by love and family until the very end. Caroline followed him 2 years later, her children and grandchildren gathered around her bed. Her last words were about Lucas, about the day he'd stepped between her and danger in those September woods, about the freedom and love he'd offered without conditions. "I chose well," she whispered with her final breath. "I chose so very well." They buried her next to Lucas on the mountain they'd both loved, under towering pines with a view of the valley spreading out below. And if you visit that spot today, you can still see their graves, weathered but carefully maintained by descendants who remember the story of the woman who ran toward freedom and the mountain man who loved her enough to let her find it. It's a reminder that the greatest love doesn't seek to trap or control, but to liberate and support. That the truest partnership is built on respect and choice, on the freedom to be yourself while choosing to share that self with another. Caroline and Lucas proved that love without conditions is possible, even in the harsh reality of frontier life. Their story became legend in the territory, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables. The trapper who tried to trap her into marriage became a cautionary tale, while the mountain man who offered freedom and love without conditions became an ideal to aspire to. Children grew up hearing about Caroline's courage and Lucas's integrity, about the life they built together based on mutual respect and unconditional love. And somewhere in the mountain winds that whistle through those same pines, you can still feel their presence. The woman who chose freedom and the man who gave it to her, together forever in the wild places they called home, their love story a testament to the power of choice, respect, and unconditional devotion. This is how love should be, the old-timers say when they tell the story. Not a trap or a cage, but a shelter freely chosen. Not a surrender of self, but a joining of two complete people who choose to walk through life together. Caroline and Lucas understood that, lived it, and left a legacy that endures long after they've gone. Their cabin still stands in that mountain clearing, carefully preserved by their descendants. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slants golden through the pines, you can almost see them there on the porch. A tall, broad-shouldered man with long dark hair and a woman with courage in her eyes, standing together and looking out at the mountains they loved. Free, loved, and exactly where they chose to be, this is their story. This is their legacy. And this is how true love endures.